Welcome, everyone. I'm David Shaw, the Publishing Director for Family Business Magazine, and I'll be your host for today's webinar. I hope that you and your families are all well and remain safe, and that you're looking forward to fall and the upcoming holidays. Today, our topic is philanthropy, especially through the lens of the donor-advised fund. We'll focus on how to increase your family's charitable impact through unique giving strategies. We'll identify highly tax-effective assets to support your charitable goals. We'll look at creating long and short-term goals to maximize your family's philanthropic legacy, and how to access resources and activities that you can use to engage the next generation in creating your family's philanthropic mission. Many of you in registering added questions that you'd like us to address, and we'll get to as many of those as we can today. You can also enter other questions or comments as they occur to you using the Ask a Question box that's under the video screen where you see me. The goal today is to be as interactive as possible within the limitations of webinar technology. We'll go for no more than 60 minutes today, and maybe less, and we'll get to as many of your questions as we can. And of course, the question that always gets asked, the slides you see here will be emailed to you following the webinar, along with some additional materials that can help you, that will be in support of the topic here. So joining me today are Jodi Rosen and Julien from Vanguard Charitable. Jodi brings over 20 years of experience in both the nonprofit sector and donor-advised fund industry, where she has served as an advocate for both philanthropists and the nonprofit community. In her current role, she manages business development and strategic product development at Vanguard Charitable. So welcome, Jodi. And Julien is a philanthropic development consultant and focuses on supporting Vanguard Charitable's most generous individuals and families through personalized consultation and service. Prior to joining Vanguard Charitable, Julien worked in corporate social responsibility at Aberdeen Asset Management. And just before I turn it over to you, Jodi, I see a question coming through asking whether this session will be recorded. And yes, it will be. So this can be viewed later and be viewed by your family members as well on the Family Business website. So with that, I'm going to step off screen, and Jodi, the floor is yours.
Thank you, David. Welcome, everybody. It's really a pleasure to be back with Family Business Magazine. First, let me say that your readers are always so engaged. So as David said, we welcome your questions along the way, anything that we don't get to within the context of the presentation. We encourage you to reach out to us post-presentation. And as David mentioned, today we're looking to engage in a conversation around how to participate in high-impact philanthropy. I think it's fair to say that most of us want to give back, but we are often unsure about how or even when to do that. So we're hoping to talk today and provide you with some tools and ideas about how to get started. And we'll do that by engaging in the conversation about how to build effective giving strategies, thoughts to consider when choosing assets that you're looking to give to charity, what steps in creating long and short-term philanthropic goals, and how to engage the next generation, just as David kind of went through that agenda. And without further ado, I do want to introduce my colleague, Julien Franklin, who will be participating with me on this webinar today.
Great, thanks so much, Jodi, and it's really a pleasure to be here with everybody. I know that we've had the pleasure to speak with this audience in the past, and I'm so happy that I was able to join today with you, Jodi, and thanks so much for the introduction, David. And I think this audience here is really well aligned and very specific to the discussion topics today around family and creating a long-term giving plan. So, I can certainly say that Jodi and I feel so fortunate to do the work that we do every day, and speaking with, individual donors and families and even businesses on formulating and executing an impactful philanthropic plan. It's just so fun and fulfilling, and being immersed in this world of philanthropy that we're in, and speaking every day with folks that are looking to be more impactful with their philanthropy is really, really such a privilege. So with that, I'd certainly just like to level set a little bit and provide a quick introduction to the specific work that we do at Vanguard Charitable. And we work in a really interesting cross-section of philanthropy and investing. We work with thousands of clients every year on executing their long-term philanthropic giving through a vehicle that's called a donor-advised fund, or a DAF for short. And Vanguard Charitable is the sponsor. We administer these DAF accounts, and we've been doing this philanthropic work for a really long time. We were founded in 1997. We ourselves are registered as a public charity, and we have over $15 billion in charitable assets right now. So just to talk a little bit about how a donor-advised fund works, it's pretty simple. A donor-advised fund is certainly not the only kind of philanthropic vehicle that's out there. It's one of them, but it certainly is a very flexible giving vehicle. It really allows donors to think more strategically and collaboratively about the charitable impact that they'd like to make. And essentially, a donor can contribute a variety of different assets into a donor-advised fund and take advantage of the highest tax efficiency allowable by the IRS. A donor can then invest the DAF account in a variety of different investment options, and all of the growth on the account is tax-free, and it's all earmarked for charitable giving. The account can be utilized for sending grants directly to charities, both domestic in the US and in many cases abroad as well. And the DAF sponsor, in our case, Vanguard Charitable, we administer all of that on behalf of our donors. So we send the checks, and the donors can operate their accounts and engage with their accounts all online in many instances. And I think really important for our conversation today is to understand that the long-term nature of strategic philanthropy or utilizing a giving vehicle allows you to incorporate family, for example, establish a legacy. It allows you to involve your family members and ensure that charitable impact can extend beyond the original donor's lifetime, for example. So again, it's just one kind of vehicle, but I think the bulk of our conversation today will really revolve around how you might think about formulating a philanthropic plan, really regardless of what vehicle you intend to utilize.
Great, Julien. So I thought to start us off, we would take a poll. And it's a poll that on the surface sounds like a very simple question. And that is, what is the purpose of your family's wealth? When you think about it, there are three buckets in which you can give your wealth to. You can give it to your family, you can give it to charity, or you can give it to the government. And so the question really is, how much do you wish to give to each area? Some of us choose to give the lion's share to our family. They say, I've been really fortunate in life, I've had success, and I want my kids to benefit from that. I want to ensure that they have a comfortable life where they have many options, regardless of what career they choose and what happens in their lives. But they also have an interest in supporting some specific causes and charities, and they want to ensure that they have the right allocation of wealth for those charities. They also recognize that it's a good way to minimize taxes that they may pay to the IRS. Other clients that I work with really put giving to charity at the top of their list. They want to make the world a better place. And they're okay with giving a smaller proportion of assets to their family because perhaps they've supported their kids with a great education and they've set them up for their own success. And so they decide that they want to put the lion's share to charity. I was talking to a couple recently who did make this decision, and one of the great things that they did was ensure that they have this conversation with their children so that there are no surprises, and it gives the children the opportunity to begin to engage in the philanthropic conversation with their parents. Now, I have to admit, I haven't spoken to many clients who have an interest in giving the lion's share to government, but you know, there's always those people out there that have that interest. So while it seems like a relatively easy question to answer, it often provides the opportunity for really powerful exercise and determine how you want your wealth to be used and divided. And at times it really can be crucially clarifying. So, you know, I would wonder if you sat down and had this conversation with your children or a spouse to determine whether or not you have the same circles. So David, I think it might be great if we could kind of see how this audience has engaged in this poll and what some of those results look like.
All right. Well, I'm sending the results off to the audience now, but 53% said family, 38% said charity. The IRS was interestingly 0. And then there was another category, just sort of general, and that was 8.5%. So the vast majority, family and charity.
That is definitely no surprise to us. That makes a lot of sense. I certainly speak with donors all the time when they're thinking about opening a donor advised fund. They say, really the purpose of my wealth is certainly family and charity, and using a philanthropic vehicle or thinking about being strategic with their philanthropy is really about having that influence over how their wealth is deployed and what kind of impact they're looking to make. So again, no surprise there. I think it's really interesting also to think about these 3 buckets and the fact that most of the respondents replied with family or charity as the purpose of their wealth. And I think, as we'll talk about today, those 2 values are really, really closely intertwined. It doesn't have to be necessarily one or the other. And I think through purposeful and deliberate planning and aligning family values and contextualizing wealth holistically, family and charity are much closer aligned than initially meets the eye. So I think those poll results are really, really interesting there. So when we talk about philanthropy being strategic, what do we mean by that? And when philanthropy is purposeful and has goals that are driven by proven practices, we find that much like an investment strategy, that attaining those specific charitable and impact goals become more realistic and intentional. And strategic philanthropy, as you can see here, is really about being long-term. It's about having a long-term time horizon. We're not just talking about, what kind of charitable impact we're looking to make this week or this year, though any charitable strategy certainly has short-term goals, but it's really about, what you plan to do for the next several years. What are you going to do with your philanthropy over the next decade? And then even past your lifetime, how are you going to implement your charitable plan when you're not here any longer? So that also means involving family. It means bringing younger generations into the philanthropic conversation early. And the earlier younger generations are involved in these kinds of philanthropic discussions and decision making, the better they can internalize a given mission and really show through with those family values. Strategic philanthropy is also very mission driven. It's really thinking deliberately about the causes that are most important to you, where and how you want to see change and how you want to affect change in the world. And it's important to think about how your philanthropy is unique to you and your family. What is it that makes your perspective on the world unique, and how might you think about changing that for the better? And finally, here we have being strategic is really about being impactful. How do you leverage your unique resources over time to make the most impact? And, resources certainly can mean funding, from a money standpoint, how much are you gifting to charity, but perhaps that also incorporates time, where are you volunteering, your talent, what are the different ways that you can impact those causes that are most important to you? And then certainly you want to think about what kind of vehicle you might choose to execute on this philanthropy. So these are all the kinds of things that go into creating a well thought out and strategic philanthropic plan.
Yeah, Julien, that's really interesting. So, as David mentioned, I've been in this philanthropic space for over 20 years. And when I started, I would say that in which people were giving to charity were through direct giving, or sometimes called checkbook charity, or through a private foundation. And what we saw was that people were using their private foundation typically when they had much larger asset base, where they had, maybe $10 million or more to give away. And those with less were making one-time contributions through that direct giving. So much has changed over the last 20 years. People have begun to access options that, quite frankly, have been around for decades and decades, but using them in a much more strategic and effective way. And with that, we've seen an increase in the use of donor advised funds, even for very large assets, because of the cost effective way that it allowed individuals and families to distribute their wealth over a long period of time. That is not to say that direct giving doesn't have a place in the marketplace. It absolutely does, as do private foundations, as do other tools and vehicles like charitable remainder trusts or lead trusts. The point is to think about how you wish to manage the vehicle in which is allowing your philanthropy to be strategic. And the very nature of being strategic means that you're thinking about it over the long term. And so it's not just, as Julien said, about what asset you're giving, but what vehicle you're using to distribute those assets. And what does it mean to be impactful and strategic? What do those words mean to you?
Yeah, it's definitely a really personal journey, Jodi, as you mentioned. And a lot of people say, okay, I know that I want to be strategic with my philanthropy. I'm thinking about the assets that I have, but where do I start? And I think we always look to start with finding your focus. It really is one of the most important steps when it comes to outlining a philanthropic plan. What's most important to you and your family? What will make you and your family's giving unique and particular? And this is one of the most important steps in this process, because no matter what philanthropic vehicle you use, and Jodi, you mentioned there's a number of them out there, no matter what assets you might consider, you're thinking about philanthropy because you want to make a positive change. That's why you're here. And this is such an important and it's surprisingly overlooked exercise in starting out strategically on a philanthropic journey. And it really is such a foundational exercise. A lot of things fall into place when you have a better idea of what you're looking to focus on. You also really want to think about your values, and thinking about your values is a building block for this work. It involves asking yourself and your family, what's your motivation for giving? You might find it helpful to think about the values you hold as a family. What's guided your business values? How might that inform your philanthropic giving? What's contributed to your success in life? Empathy, hard work, kindness, tradition. These are all different values that we've heard our donors talk about. We certainly have some resources that we'll mention in this, later on in this presentation as well, but some activities that can help you elicit these, not just for yourself, but also for your family. And then the next step is aligning your values to your cause areas. Focusing on the values you've outlined will definitely help you focus on the charitable causes that mean the most to you, those causes that align with you the most. Some popular causes that we've seen our donors focus on and give to, certainly environment, wildlife, food and nutrition, education, health. You really want to think about what causes do you and your family feel connected to. And I hear day in and day out when folks are going through this exercise, they tell me that this is really where things get fun. When you start to think about the specific causes and charities that you might be looking to support, this really starts to bring your focus to life and makes things a bit more tangible, I think.
Yeah. And I think it's fair to say that your focus will change over time. David, did you have a question that you wanted to pop in with?
I think so. Julie, you were saying that the fun kind of goes on in terms of figuring out where those values lie for everyone and what you want to focus on. But what happens if there is some generational distinction between values, let's say? What if the younger generation has a different set of values than the older generation? How do you work through that?
Yeah, that's a really, really good question. I think in terms of setting out values, it really is a very internal discussion that you need to have. When it comes to talking about this as a family, I think that putting everything out on the table is really important. I find that, sure, generations may feel like there's a gap in what the different generations feel are important or what causes each of the generations might want to support. But I think with more discussion, talking about what's important to each individual that's across generations, I think there's a really good chance to find some overlap there. The other thing that I'd say is when utilizing something like a donor advised fund or a philanthropic vehicle, there's also this idea of charitable allowances in a way. So maybe a philanthropic plan doesn't just focus on a few specific causes. It certainly can, But if there's causes that are important to family members across generations, perhaps there's a certain budget that's allocated to supporting the specific cause areas of the individuals in the generations, and then the family can come together to help out and talk about more holistic giving that spans the cause areas that all the generations can agree on.
It's a good solution. Thanks.
And I can bring that to light with a story. If I just have a minute to share a story, I did work with a CEO and his family relatively early on in my career. We were having a family meeting, and the CEO had this exact question. Now, he ran a big corporation. He's used to making decisions for that corporation, and he is oftentimes looked to as the primary leader. But this was a different conversation. This was a conversation that you want to be sure you're not losing the interests of the next generation by, banging your hand on the table and making that decision for the families. So they had two choices. They could create a budget for each person to go off and do their own philanthropy, or they could come and find common ground. In this case, the daughter was extremely passionate about underserved communities in Nepal, and the father was incredibly passionate about education. Now, those two things on the surface couldn't seem farther apart, but through conversation, dialogue, and understanding, and going through a process of understanding key values and where your focus is, we're actually able to come to alignment. So I think by starting and asking yourself, do you want to do this as a family? Do you want to come together and have a focus together as a family, or do you want to do it independently? I think is a critical question in getting started. So I think that that's a great question, David. Thank you.
Okay, I'll be back with more.
Okay. The other point that I'll just make is that, we do go through this process of finding our focus and understanding our key values, but that changes over time. And it likely will change based on your age and stage in life and your children's age and stage in life. So, I'm happy to kind of share a little bit of personal experience about how I came to my particular focus. Growing up, I grew up in a family that put giving back high on the list. And I remember as a little girl walking around with bags of food through a Meals on Wheels program and delivering that to older individuals' homes. And it was that process that gave me a greater understanding about what it means to help others. And I've kind of carried that through my life. My husband and I now contribute not only our time, but we also can contribute our treasure and our talent. We personally had a tragedy struck our family, and it caused us to really take a pause and say, do we have enough focus in our giving? Or are we giving so sporadically that we're not able to really measure the impact? And through that, we decided that for our own family, it was important to support an organization that taught school-age children mindfulness and meditation. And I'm able to contribute my financial resources. I sit on an advisory committee and I volunteer. So it really kind of takes that holistic view of time, talent, and treasure. But that doesn't mean that we don't have flexibility in our budget to respond to needs in our community or crises that arise. We want to make sure that we're budgeting appropriately so that we can maintain our focus and support all of those other asks and needs that come up along the way. And that's one of the benefits of having that strategic philanthropic focus, not just with what it is that you want to do, but how do you want to do it? Again, we use a donor advised fund because it gives us that flexibility, not only to respond to issues and causes today, but plan for the future. And also think about how are those assets invested so that when the market is doing better and my assets are growing, I have greater flexibility in my budget to either support my key focus areas or support other key needs in the community.
Yeah, I think it's definitely about being flexible, Jodi. And what I've learned from donors that I've speaking with over the years is that no philanthropic journey really starts the same or necessarily evolves the same. Some donors have had a philanthropic plan that they look to streamline and make more efficient through using a giving vehicle, for example. Others may have a specific event, a personal event that you shared, Jodi. I certainly think folks can relate to that. Even when it comes to something like, for example, a life event such as a new employment or a financial windfall or a bonus, that's kind of when folks might also start thinking strategically about their philanthropy. So you also want to talk about defining your mission. That's a really specific step when crafting the purpose and direction for your philanthropy. And your mission can certainly be ever evolving. You can revisit it yearly. Once you've identified your core values and your causes, creating a mission statement is a great next step to help focus your philanthropic plan. And I often get asked by clients about, how do you go about creating a mission statement? And it doesn't have to be long or complicated. In fact, it can be really simple, or it can be more detailed. There's no really right or wrong way to craft a mission statement, but having a mission statement allows you to think about your giving for the present and the future, and in times of crisis, like you were mentioning, Jodi. So that's definitely a really important step to make this more tangible for sure. And we've got some great resources that you can utilize for facilitating, the conversations with your family. As I mentioned before, helping them find their focus and find your focus. Having them written down really allows this process to be less abstract. It becomes more concrete when you put these down to paper. You can even share it. You can review your values, your causes, and your mission at various points. And it also, I think, importantly, holds you and your family accountable. It's really about being deliberate with the philanthropic decisions. And none of this is set in stone. It can seem a little bit intimidating, but none of this is set in stone. It can always be changed. We like to call it a living, breathing exercise. And if you put it down on paper, it's a living and breathing document, which can certainly change over time and can change from one generation to the next. I think that's the beauty of this as well, is that each generation can have their impact on how a mission or how the focus and the values evolve over time. So we definitely recommend, for example, having a specific time when your family might get together to talk about this. Maybe it's around the holidays when your family can get together to discuss these things as a group. But being really intentional about that can be overlooked in many cases, and it really goes a long way.
Yeah, Julien, I think it's always great when you set a date. Put that date in your calendar, because it's so easy just to kind of keep pushing this conversation off. So I think you're absolutely right, setting that time. I always like to say that philanthropic giving is a team sport, right? It's not something that you can go at alone. Whether it's a nonprofit that you're working with, that's part of the process and the plan. Whether it's working with a financial advisor to help you choose the right assets. You want to take a step back and decide, who do you want to have a seat at your table? For some people, it's a family affair. And we talked about what that could look like when you are building consensus as a family. Who do you want to involve? Do you want to involve your spouse or partner? Do you want to involve your children or your grandchildren? Are you working with a philanthropic advisor or perhaps a program officer at a nonprofit who's helping to guide you on, issue-based causes? Is there an expert who's familiar with that particular area? Perhaps you are building a philanthropic structure for your business and you want to make sure that you're a good corporate citizen. And at your table, you've included people from your business to help guide you through those questions. Deciding who has a seat at the charitable table and making sure that you have the right people at your table is part of the philanthropic journey and very much needed in order to create a strong foundation. And remember, when it comes to philanthropy, who has that seat at the table also has a voice. So I often have to remind myself when talking to my own children, just because I'm older in this conversation doesn't mean I'm necessarily wiser. And so when you're bringing in the next generation, make sure that they have that voice so it keeps them engaged in the conversation.
Definitely. And I work with donors all the time that are bringing this up and are thinking about how to involve the next generation. I recently worked with a client who'd sold a business and decided to open a donor advised fund to take advantage of the tax efficiency during a high income year. And she and her family were in a new position of having a substantial amount to allocate to the family's philanthropy. They hadn't really been in this position before. They certainly had a long-term vision with a goal of utilizing a DAF for a minimum of 3 generations. They actually set out and put it down on paper how long sort of the minimum tenure for this account would last. And in Christmas of 2020, the family gathered to put down a mission statement, cause areas of focus, which really centered around poverty alleviation and hunger. And the donor was involving her grown children, their spouses, and her grandchildren, all of whom lived across the country. And the donors decided to allocate a charitable allowance, just as we discussed before. It sounds like somebody had a question about this. You're thinking about this. Allocating a certain amount for the grandchildren to be able to actually set out and gift out, to causes that they were very closely aligned with. They even allowed the grandchildren to get involved in the crafting of the mission statement. So I thought that was just a really apt example of how folks are looking to get the next generation involved. And again, like you said, Jodi, setting a date I think is really important, so that everybody knows when these discussions will be had and can think about them ahead of time. So certainly involving the family early is incredibly important.
Yeah, for sure. Now, when we think about making an impact, it's not only about the grants that we're giving out to support charities, and it's not only about the tool that we're using or who has a seat at the table. It's also about choosing what assets make sense. And what type of dollars you're thinking about using. And when we think about that, there's really a wide variety of different asset types you might consider. So I would say that those philanthropists that are most strategic are using a wide variety of assets. Some of them are using publicly traded securities that give them the opportunity to make that gift to charity, avoid paying those capital gains, getting the fair market value deduction on those assets. Some are choosing to use stock because it allows them to take a higher percentage of their adjusted gross income. Some are using illiquid assets. They're looking beyond their standard portfolio and they're thinking about business interests or private stock or even art or real estate as what it is they want to gift, because they're perhaps highly appreciated, low basis, a good asset for charitable purposes. And so assets like these can be given typically really easily through a donor advised fund vehicle. One of the benefits of using a DAF in this scenario is that you have the opportunity to contribute larger assets in one lump sum and then distribute it to many charities over a longer period of time. But again, choosing the assets that you wish to contribute is all part of that philanthropic strategic journey.
Definitely. Once you've thought about your assets, as you mentioned, Jodi, you definitely want to consider the giving vehicle specifically. Obviously, you've learned a little bit about donor advised funds. Jodi, you'd mentioned private foundations, which I'm sure a lot of the folks in the audience have heard of. They might have heard of charitable lead trusts, charitable remainder trusts. So there are different vehicles out there. And we even work with donors that utilize multiple giving vehicles as well. It's not necessarily either or when choosing a vehicle. But we certainly recommend that when you're thinking about what vehicle to utilize, you consider the differences, because there are certainly pros and cons to the different giving vehicles. We really look to highlight 6 specific factors that you might consider when researching different philanthropic vehicles. And the first one is tax efficiency. You want to outline the types of assets that you often gift, as Jodi had mentioned, and then ensure for the optimal tax deduction. You certainly want to consider cost. Decide what you're willing to pay for a strategic giving vehicle. With the understanding that the more spent on fees, the less is potentially available for giving to charity. You also want to think about control what level of control do you and or your family want with a giving vehicle, and you want to choose how much direct oversight and decision-making power you'd like to have with a given vehicle. When it comes to the distribution to charity, you also want to ensure that the vehicle you're using can support the kinds of charities that you're really interested in. You want to ensure that the giving vehicle allows you to support a range of causes that you're looking to pursue. You also want to consider recognition. Some donors certainly like to share their information with the nonprofits that they're looking to support, but it's not something that you have to do with every philanthropic vehicle. So do you want to keep your giving more private? That is available to some philanthropic vehicles and not in others. And then certainly, as we spoke about today, leaving a legacy. How is the vehicle going to allow you to pass your legacy on to future generations to you, and really choosing a tool that allows you to do that the most effectively is definitely something you want to consider as well.
Yeah. So Julien, we are packing a lot into this conversation. We're talking about the what you want to give, how you want to give, what vehicle you wish to give through, the conversations with your families, asset types. We're really packing a lot in, and want to forget to talk about when you're thinking about your overall strategic philanthropy is your investment strategy. Much like you manage an investment strategy as a retail investor or an institutional investor, you want to make sure that you're taking that disciplined approach and you're staying true to the foundational investment principles. Investor holds true for a philanthropist. You are, oftentimes looking for a balanced strategy that will maximize your impact over time. And so you want to have clear goals. You want to have clear goals that meet your timeline horizon, that help you to meet your mission, that are measurable. You want to be aware of cost, right? So are you working with an investment allocation that is extremely erodes some of your opportunity to grant out to charities? Cost is always something to consider when thinking about your investment strategy. You always want to maintain perspective and have that long-term discipline. So stay focused on what it is that you're looking to achieve with philanthropy. And if that includes including some ESG options into your overall investment plan, you would then have the opportunity to make an impact both on the investment side as well as on the grant making side. But one thing that I think Julien and I cannot stress enough through all of this and through the many things that we talked about today is that it's incredibly important to have fun. Giving back is one of the best gifts that you can give to yourself and to your family and to others. So please, I encourage you, make sure that fun is at the top of your list of all the things that you take away today.
Definitely, it's one of the reasons, as I mentioned earlier, it's one of the reasons why I love working in the space that we do, and seeing how folks are really living through their values and having fun doing that. So you're right, Jodi. This is really what it's all about. So I don't think there's any better way to kind of show how utilizing a philanthropic vehicle like a donor-advised fund and having a long-term strategic plan really plays out, other than showing you a case study with an actual example of a Vanguard charitable donor. And over the long term, you'll see here in this example how utilizing a DAF has allowed this specific individual to make more impact than perhaps they would have just by giving a large lump sum to charity. So this donor had been with us since 1997 when we were founded, so a very long-term donor. They were a grateful cancer survivor who wanted to donate to support to further research at the hospital where they received treatment. They knew that we wanted to provide a substantial amount of support over the long term as researchers continue to make progress in the specific field of research. And his tax advisor and he discussed utilizing about $500,000 worth of appreciated assets for tax efficient giving. Definitely taking advantage of tax efficiency was important to this specific donor. But instead of gifting directly to the hospital, for example, he decided to contribute that into a donor-advised fund and get that tax deduction up front, opened the account, and he knew that the assets, given the investment options that were available to him, the idea of leveraging investments long-term, would allow the account to grow tax-free over time. The donor also knew that he wanted to start sending grants right away to the hospital. So, we talked about a long-term plan, but obviously he wanted to make an impact now. So he allocated an investment strategy of about 70% stocks to 30% bonds. It's a fairly aggressive investment strategy. And he structured his account so that automatic recurring grants of 12.5% would be sent out once a year to the hospital. So that was even $40,000 a year. That's pretty substantial. We call this save to give. So by saving to give, the client made a substantially larger impact over time. Through his annual grants over 20 years, he donated more than $800,000 to this specific cancer research, again, which is obviously significantly more than that $500,000 that he had put into the account back in 1997. He still retains, as you can see here, nearly $130,000 in the donor-advised fund, and he nearly doubled his giving capacity. So overall, he increased his impact by 88% by using a donor-advised fund over a 20-year period. And given this long-term plan for the account, he was able to accomplish a few things. He was able to maintain an even closer relationship with the hospital. He was deeply intertwined in the research that they were doing, since he was, with them and speaking to them over the course of that 20-year period. And he even included the hospital as a beneficiary on his DAF, so that upon his passing, a certain portion of the account would go to the hospital. And he also named his grandchildren as successor advisors on the DAF. So not only was he able to support, he will be able to support that hospital past his lifetime, but he's going to involve his children in that as well. And they're going to partake in this donor advised fund when he's no longer here. So I would definitely say that's not a bad outcome when considering the impact that the donor would have made just by sending a one-time gift to the hospital.
It's remarkable. And those stories touch my heart every single time, the impact that they're able to make through that Save to Give modeling. So Julien and I have spent a great deal of time kind of giving you some insight into what it means to be a strategic philanthropist. This is a lifelong journey, and we recognize that over the course of the last 40 minutes, it's a lot to take in. And so we do have resources available on our public web. And of course, you can reach out to us after the fact, because we recognize that, again, this is a journey. We will help you through this journey or find a trusted advisor to help you through this journey. I will say that the Giving Matters Guide, which Julien had mentioned earlier, is a fantastic resource to get you started on that foundational path forward in your high impact philanthropy journey. And so with that, I would love to take some time to hear what your audience has asked or shared, David. And I know that Julien and I would look forward to responding to some of those questions.
Okay, terrific. Thank you. First, I just wanted to come back to sort of the beginning. When we talk about DAFs or donor advised funds, let's talk about the differences between a DAF and a private foundation, for example. I would assume it's less money required to get started, fewer expenses, but can you outline that a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. So I would say on the surface, donor advised funds and private foundations seek to accomplish much of the same objective, which is to think about how you are able to give to charity today and in the future. Now, when we think about some differences, a donor advised fund, for example, does not currently have a payout requirement relative to annual grants that are required to be distributed from that donor advised fund. Whereas a private foundation requires that you distribute 5% of those assets on an annual basis. That's not to say that most donor-advised fund providers, including Vanguard Charitable, does have a policy around making grants on a periodic basis. In our case, it's every 3 years. Because, of course, we're a grant maker. We want to make sure that those dollars are getting out the door. Donor-advised funds allow you to keep the costs generally lower than a private foundation because at Vanguard Charitable, our administrative fee is lowest in the industry, whereas a private foundation, you're often paying for advice from a financial advisor who's managing the assets, a tax advisor who is filing your 990 forms. You are required to have a board structure. You want to make sure that you are aware of all the rules and regulations relative to your due diligence. Much of that work is covered under the administrative expense of the donor advised fund.
Okay.
So I would say DAFs tend to be more cost effective, and the compliance and legal requirements relative to the vehicle are covered by the sponsoring organization.
And I would just add to that, Jodi, in terms of the folks that I speak with, a lot of folks have heard of private foundations and maybe aren't as familiar with a vehicle like a donor-advised fund. But we say unless it's really 10 million plus with something like a private foundation, it's hard to justify the cost in many regards. And we at Vanguard Charitable certainly have accounts in excess of that range. But a lot of people think private foundation is the only way that I can go about doing this. But when they learn about a donor-advised fund, how simple it is, and the fact that they can support a lot of the same public charities for the same purposes that they could through a private foundation, a donor-advised fund certainly makes a lot of sense.
Okay. I had a quick question about the example, the case study that you showed. What was the agreement with the hospital on that example? How did the hospital understand that DAF agreement?
So the hospital over the long term, I'm not sure if they'd utilize something called a grant agreement specifically, but it is something that can be utilized with the donor advised fund. But it was sort of the specific research that hospital was doing in this sort of cancer space specifically. But that is certainly the something that donors might want to think about is, are there certain goals that you might want to have with your giving in a specific nonprofit? Should the nonprofit be meeting specific goals for contingency funding, for example? So as folks are getting more strategic about their giving, they're thinking about that. They're thinking about outlining metrics and holding the nonprofit accountable to certain goals as well. So you certainly have the ability to do that with a donor advised fund. Not sure in this specific example if that was utilized, but something that we're hearing more and more.
Okay.
Yeah, for sure. And just to kind of elaborate, to make sure that we're level setting on what a grant agreement is. So when you're doing some direct giving, you have the opportunity to pledge assets to that organization so that they can document that in their books and they know that that money is coming. In the case of a donor advised fund, because you've made that contribution in and gotten that tax deduction, you no longer own those assets to pledge. And so what Vanguard Charitable and many other donor advised fund providers are able to do is enter into an agreement on your behalf. We call that a grant agreement, which by all intents and purposes allows Vanguard Charitable to pledge those assets on behalf of the fund. And so then the nonprofit understands that they have those assets coming to them should they meet the requirements.
Okay. Good. All righty. Earlier, you talked about next-gen engagement, and some of the questions that we received from the audience in advance of the webinar were really focused on that. Especially, you also talked about making giving fun, and that kind of brings us around to that 12 to 18-year-old group. They could get involved, right? But how do you make it? What kind of activities can be used with that group to really keep them involved and understanding what their money is doing?
Well, I have an 11 and a 14-year-old, so I may be speaking from experience, but I can also share a little bit of what I've heard from some of our donors. So in my house, it's really important that they understand the importance of giving back. And That's both with the financial resources that my husband and I have, and that's also with their own financial resources. Because I think they need to have a little skin in the game to understand the importance of giving back. So we make it a priority when they get birthday money or allowance that a piece of that is set aside for supporting others. It's also really important that they are finding at this age in particular something that they feel really passionate about. So my son, for example, spends his Sundays doing a soccer program with children who have learning differences. And every Sunday morning, he wakes up and he plays soccer with them. It allows him to connect his own passion of soccer and giving that experience to other children. I really feel like at this age, it's important to help them find their passion so that they have a love of giving back and they understand what that's all about.
Definitely, and in the giving guide, in the Giving Matters guide that we've talked about, we actually have some example exercises specifically for different age groups. And I think sort of the younger generation, even younger than 11 years old, let's say, it can really be about experimentation. I mean, perhaps they don't yet know what they're really connected to, but encouraging them to learn about different organizations or different causes. And volunteering, obviously that's a little bit hard to do in this COVID environment that we're in, but certainly learn to have some on the ground experience with different nonprofits. And then as they get older, really involving them in the decision making. I mean, we've had a couple examples here where we've talked about, a donor advised fund holder giving a charitable allowance and involving kids in the structuring of the mission statement, for example. So there's a lot of ways to go about that. There's a lot of ways to make it fun. Again, I'll plug that giving guide, but we have some very practical examples in that, which we're happy to share with folks.
I'm assuming that we're going to send a link to that giving guide to all of our webinar attendees to follow up. So you'll have that opportunity to read through that guide. That's great. I did have another question here that came in. There's some fascination with the save spend approach. Is there a general recommendation for a percentage split of yearly save spend for a DAF, i.e., is the best practice to invest 5, 10, 15% of current holdings per year? What do you think?
I think it goes back to what is it you're trying to accomplish? What is the cause you're looking to affect? What is the time frame in which you're looking to affect that? When we think about that save to give modeling, again, I'm going to encourage people to think about their own personal investable assets and how do they think about saving for college, saving for retirement, saving for a home renovation. The time frame may be different, your objectives are different, and you want to make sure that you're maximizing the income earned on those investments during that time frame that you have.
Okay, great. There was a comment that came through from an old friend of mine. Hi, Barb. You will get the slides as well. Yes, indeed. Afterwards, a link to that and a link to the replay. It's good to see you, at least virtually. You've both talked about mission throughout this webinar and mission statements and so on. And I'm wondering, are there any examples of mission statements or an approach to a mission statement that you've seen that particularly works?
Yeah, certainly. I think the mission statement is one of those parts of this process where you have to get a little bit more specific, and that can be a little bit daunting and confusing. But first off, I'd say it really involves what causes are you looking to support? What cause you want to incorporate that? Who will benefit? Who are the specific constituencies that will benefit from your philanthropy specifically, and where will it happen? So the mission statement really allows you to be, we mentioned it can be very specific. It doesn't have to be too specific, but it allows you to sort of have that guiding light in terms of the organizations that you're looking to support over time with changing philanthropic landscapes. We certainly have all heard of the large foundations. I would definitely encourage folks to go online and see the mission statements for those types of organizations. We've had a couple, for example, I'll fund programs that support pediatric health care, for example, in my home state of Pennsylvania. The Franklin family's mission is to support arts around the world. So even it's, around the world, both domestically and internationally, it's very specific, so that ensuring school children have the means and resources to explore their artistic expression, for example. So, you really weave in your values as well, and it kind of ties in everything that you've been doing throughout this process and finding your focus and defining your values and aligning that to the specific cause areas in a nice, concise way.
Excellent. You mentioned earlier some of the costs of administering or managing the funds. What do those structures typically look like within a DAF, I guess?
Sure. So within a DAF, there's typically, and I'll speak specifically about Vanguard Charitable, an all-in cost structure, which includes the administrative fee and the investment cost. So we want to make it as transparent as possible. The expense ratio on the investments is just that. Because of our relationship with our founder, Vanguard, we have the benefit of providing at-cost investments. Vanguard tends to be the lowest in the industry when it comes to investments, so our donors have the opportunity to benefit from that low-cost investment option. On the administrative side, costs typically, and this is the case at Vanguard Charitable, operate on a tiered structure. So at Vanguard Charitable, the first $500,000 is assessed 60 basis points, or just a little over 0.5%. The next $500,000 is assessed 30 basis points, and it continues to go down from there. Over $1 million, I think it's $1 million to 13 million is 13 basis points. So it continues to go down from there. So it's a weighted fee based on a tiered structure.
Okay.
And we've got a great resource on our public website that I'm sure we might be able to send to the audience as well. It's called our cost calculator, and it's a really easy tool. You just plug in a hypothetical account balance, and you can actually see what that administrative fee would be and that investment fee. You can play around with the different investment options that we offer and see what your all-in fee would be annually. So for folks that are interested in costs and are thinking about perhaps utilizing a philanthropic vehicle, I think that cost calculator that we have on our public website is a fantastic place to start.
Sounds
Yeah,
good.
and I'll just add that fee structure is built into the assets within the fund. So it's 1/365th is taken out every day from the fund.
Got it. Okay. Excellent. Well, any final comments before we come to a close here?
David, I would just thank you again for the opportunity to talk to your audience. Again, it's always such a wonderful experience working with individuals who are engaged in philanthropy, and you have a wonderful group of engaged readers. So thank you.
I would echo the same thing. I know that we're approaching what we call giving season towards the end of the year, when a lot of folks are thinking about a tax-efficient, philanthropic giving. So certainly feel free to reach out to us, and our phone number is right there on the slide. I'm sure we'll be getting in touch with folks so that they can reach out to us directly as well. So we'd be thrilled to hear from you and really love the engagement that you all have shown today.
Terrific, terrific. Well, thank you both for sharing your insights today. I thought this was really, really terrific. Again, I'll note a copy of the presentation, the replay link will go to you, as well as some links to additional materials. I would also note that we'll be exploring more issues related to philanthropy, and especially the family dynamics of philanthropy, at our upcoming Transitions Fall Conference, which will be held online November 3rd through 5th. We hope that it's the last of our major online conferences. So we have high hopes that the pandemic will be in the rearview mirror next year. In the meantime, I wish all of you continued good health and good philanthropy, good giving, and a great holiday season coming up. Please do reach out to us if you have any questions. And in the meantime, I'm going to disconnect the webcast, and we'll see you at the next one. Thank you, Julien. Thank you, Jodi.
Thank you.